if you had to write on paper and use a typewriter, how productive would you be? And I would say the same thing for the factory worker. If those tools and the robots and the machines that were available to you, how much would you make? Again, it's this idea of like contrasting the bulldozer operator or someone who uses a backhoe versus someone with a shovel.
Yeah.
You're just so much more productive with that capital. And that capital, again, reflects other people and yourself, putting money aside and saying, let's invest this in the future. We're going to invest this in a piece of machinery or what have you, which is going to make the society as a whole much more productive. What that ultimately is delayed consumption, right? Mm-hmm. And we want to encourage that. And again, that having productive, offices and having productive factories, that benefits everybody.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential. And here's your host, Jeff Crank.
Well, thanks for being with us for another episode of American Potential. Of course, it's Jeff Crank along with our new host, David Fromm. And if you haven't watched our episode explaining why the podcast has a new host, it's because I decided to run for Congress, and I won. So with me heading to Washington, we needed to bring someone new on the show to be able to continue to share the amazing stories of individuals making a difference in their community. Now, I also want to note that this episode was recorded before January 3rd, which will be the day that I will be sworn into office. Now, before we talk to our guest today, I wanted to ask David a question. David, you and your wife have 11 kids. Do you even remember do you remember all their names? Do you remember all their ages?
Well, I know all their first names for sure. And little known fact, I actually carry a laminated piece of paper in my wallet with all their names and birth dates on it. And yeah, since we're talking about taxes today, I kind of consider them like all my little tax credits.
That's their nickname, is all your little tax credits?
Yeah.
That's great.
So as we get into today's episode, we have Patrick Fleernor on with us, and he's a tax policy fellow for Americans for Prosperity. And we have Patrick on because at the time of this episode's release, the 119th Congress is in session. And we want to talk about policies that would help promote freedom and opportunity, including letting people keep more of their hard-earned money. That's why today we're focusing on taxes, specifically the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is set to expire at the end of 2025. So what exactly is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and why does it matter? It was passed in 2017, intended to stimulate economic growth, simplify the tax code, and offer relief to both individuals and businesses. These tax cuts were able to help businesses expand, hire new employees, and let them explore new ways to promote their businesses. So let's get into it, Patrick. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great. Well, hey, before we talk about, taxes specifically, why don't you give us a little bit of an idea of, how you got into the exciting world of tax policy?
Well, I grew up in the Detroit area in the late 70s and 80s, and sort of experienced the problems caused by poor tax policy and other policy, firsthand. I mean, I lived in a community where people lost their jobs. That you had big problems in the auto industry. We had big overall economic. And when I was in college, for example, the '82 recession was going on. So you just see its impact on people's lives, and you're wondering, why is all this happening? And I remember in high school, asking my teachers, well, why are people unemployed? Why does money lose its value every day? And no one could give me satisfactory answers. But fortunately, in college, I took an economics course, and it was just it was an introductory economics course. It was a totally mind-opening experience. I mean, it changed my life and sort of put me on the course to where I am today. So, in that micro class, for the first time, I kind of understood, taxes, for example, affect prices. If you tax Coke, people are like just Coke and not Pepsi. People are likely to substitute Pepsi for Coke. So you sort of see the power of taxes and how they could help for the good, how they could do good things as well as bad things. So then I went to grad school, and while I was at grad school, I started working at the Tax Foundation. And I worked there spent a large portion of my career there. I worked on the Capitol Hill as well, and also as an economic consultant. So I've, from the initial bug in high school to back to here at AFP today as a tax policy fellow, sort of taxes got into my blood and stayed there.
So, I think a lot of us who've worked in tax policy understand that, there's a real correlation between people's behavior and tax policy. But right. I don't know. Maybe a lot of our listeners don't really know that, or a lot of people don't feel that in their regular life. I mean, maybe can you talk a little bit about how that affects people's decision making and how it affects families?
Sure. Taxes are subtle. They have subtle but important effects. I mean, the two big places they have in our lives is they affect people's decisions to save, to work and save and invest. Work effort's kind of obvious, right? You levy tax. People earn less, and people spend more time on the golf course and less time in the office. And that's kind of the perverse incentive that's created by, say, high income taxes. So, I mean, that's one effect. The second effect is somewhat more subtle. It's the effect on savings and investment, is that taxes discourage people from saving. And because essentially income earned from if you spend your income immediately, I mean, interest is paid to people who save some of their income and save it for the future. And they earn interest as a result. But unfortunately, the current tax system taxes interest, so that discourages the interest that's earned on savings from saving. And what that means, it means two things, really. It means that people are less prepared for savings and for calamities in retirement, and become more dependent on government. In addition, it means that for our economy as a whole, we have less money with which to invest in capital equipment. And capital equipment's important because it basically drives wages. I mean, imagine you see two workers, one who has a shovel and another who has a bulldozer, right? It's not hard to imagine who earns a higher wage. It's of course the person with the bulldozer. He has a higher wage because that piece of capital, what we economists call capital, the bulldozer, just makes him so much more productive. And in a competitive economy like we have in the United States, people's wages are highly dependent on how productive they are. So we want to encourage as much capital investment as possible. But the thing that people need to remember is that all of those, when people walk down the street and they see office buildings and they see bulldozers or backhoes and all this equipment, or they go into a factory and see all the robots and all the machines, all that represents delayed saving. I mean, delayed consumption. That's basically the product of people saying, I'm going to put away for tomorrow and I'll consume in the future. And that delayed delayed consumption is basically invested into our economy. It builds all these productive assets that we have and raises wages. But like I said, unfortunately, our tax system discourages that. And it has, again, a very subtle but a very profound effect.
Patrick, our tax code, the federal tax code, has over 6,000 pages, right, of tax code. And I often think that Congress uses that, right, to sort of reward friends and punish enemies and things like that. And wouldn't it be better if we could reduce some of that 6,000 pages, make it a lot simpler and easier, and encourage investment, right?
Absolutely. Oddly enough, the 6,000 pages is just the tip of the iceberg. You would never really understand how the tax system worked if you just read those 6,000 pages, because it's just to the average person, it's just a bunch of gobbledygook. You would have to read tens of thousands of pages of IRS rules and regulations and case law to understand how it truly worked. And that's why accountants and lawyers specialize in taxation. They basically spend their entire lives trying to learn how the tax system works. And that's important because how is the average person ever supposed to understand how the tax system works if it requires people dedicate their entire lives to it? But yeah, of course you're right. I mean, much of that, those rules and regulations are specific provisions in the tax code, taking from all of us Peters to give to Paul, right? And that's why people, lobby they'll lobby the government for a specific tax provision. Because right. I want to give Paul money, right? Congress could do it two ways, right? It could write a piece of legislation that says, give Paul $100,000, but obviously there are people who would be outraged at such a blatant thing. A more subtle way they can do is put it in the tax code, right? They can say, well, a business of this size located in this area, which basically only matches Paul.
Sure.
They can send the money that way, and it's indirect, and people don't, it's not obvious to people why that happened.
Yeah.
Go ahead. To answer your question, of course, right, reducing the tax code could be reduced dramatically. Serious tax plans like the Hallward-Bushka flat tax talk about, reducing the tax forms down to just two postcard-sized forms, one for business, one for individuals. That's very plausible.
And the other advantage to doing something like that is that you probably greatly reduce the power, size, and influence of the IRS
Absolutely.
And the federal government, right? And the enforcement of that code.
Absolutely. That plan in particular, and there's many others like it.
Yeah.
Again, they would get rid of the problems of disincentives to work and save and invest, so that we would fix that. They would take away a lot of sort of backroom deals. They would take away the ability for politicians to basically take from the general public and give to specific interest groups through the tax system, which is it's a big problem in the current system.
Well, I think and it advantages, members of Congress and politicians to have a code like that they can hide those sorts of things in, right?
Exactly. It does strike one as sort of strange that why to just collect taxes? Which is not a small endeavor, but you would think, well, why would people have to dedicate their lives to learning all these ins and outs of a process, which again could be done very simply, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a simple tax which just say levied a 20% tax on all income or all consumption, it wouldn't be difficult at all.
Yeah.
But again, it would take a lot of power out of Washington.
Yeah. They say, a lot of people, I think, look at it, though, a little bit simplistically. Let's say you cut these taxes and that wasn't coming in, then they would say, well, then the government's not going to have that revenue to spend. It isn't that simple, is it?
Well, there's two parts to that. Again, we could raise the exact same amount of revenue from a much simpler system.
Sure.
Again, like the Hallward-Bushka flat tax, that could raise to the penny, that could raise the exact same amount of money because it's just a question of the tax base or
the percentage that you levy. Right.
That's the second part is the percentage or the rate that's used.
Right.
So right now we have a fairly narrow tax base with a lot of holes in it, a lot of special exemptions. And because the base is fairly narrow, we require relatively high rates to extract X amount of revenue from that. If we expanded the base and removed the holes, we could get the same amount of revenue from a much lower tax.
Yeah. David?
So with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act set to expire, what can people expect?
Well, unfortunately, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is the best piece of tax legislation perhaps we've had in maybe 100 years.
Really,
it's excellent. And that's coming from someone who's fairly cynical about politics and taxes in general. No, it's an excellent piece of legislation, and but for that reason, it won't go away. Even if Kamala Harris had won the presidency, it would still be on the agenda. It would be slightly different. She'd likely limit it for upper income people, but it has improved the tax system so much that I think it would be hard not to renew. So
what elements make it, in your opinion, so good?
Well, a number of them. It reduces individual tax rates across the board, which is very good. Again, for the reasons I talked about earlier, it improves incentives to save and invest and to work. The higher tax rates go, the bigger those problems become. So those are good provisions. It also expands the tax base, as we were talking about earlier. it removed it capped the SALT deduction and the mortgage interest deduction, for example. Those two things expand the tax base, and those allow for in part rates to be lowered. Another thing it does is it encouraged people to by doubling the standard deduction, for example. It encouraged people to take the standard deduction in lieu of the of itemizing, and the problem. And there's a bunch of problems here, but one of the problems with the current system is it encourages investment in residential housing, again, rather than in productive plant and equipment. Ideally, we'd want the tax system to be what economists call neutral between the two of those. It would both would be treated equally under the law. If some people wanted to own homes and some people wanted to rent, there would be parity between those two decisions. And you would take away that distortion again to not invest in the future, which again, that's very pernicious in that it ultimately reduces people's wages. Because, the nurse or the doctor in the hospital doesn't have the latest piece of equipment, nor does the factory worker. And again, those pieces of equipment, the reason we have high wages in this country is in large part due because we have very high levels of capital investment. But they're not as high as they would be if the tax system wasn't so distortionary.
Right. Yeah. It seemed. What can you think the American people expect? Right out of right now, there's discussion that Congress, as you said, is going to renew the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Right. But we talked about maybe going to a system that would eliminate the IRS. Make it possible to eliminate the IRS. I doubt Congress has the courage or the votes maybe to do that. I'd love to see it, but your thoughts on that? How far do you think they'll go?
Well, that was one reason why I said that the reason that the TCJA is a great piece of legislation in that it provides a vehicle to go much further. Again, its central philosophy is one of broadening the tax base and reducing tax rates. All right, and it also encourages. It has incentives to save within it. Imagine just taking that a couple steps further, right? Say that we eliminated all exclusions and exemptions of income. So we had a very broad tax base. We could further reduce rates and say we added another provision that said you can save an unlimited amount of money in your IRA, right? We're just instead of the current caps, we're just going to reduce those. Well, you've gone a long ways to solving a lot of the problems in the tax space, and again, in the tax system, and again because we can vary rates, right? We can always just raise or lower rates. We can always hit a revenue target.
Yeah,
and these get rid of the other distortions.
Do you think that part of the reason Congress has made this so complicated, and again, part of it is you can reward people and your constituents don't easily know that you're rewarding, Paul,
right, sure,
or whatever. Is another part of it though to avoid having to vote on, if you raise a tax rate from 15% to 16%, the American people pretty easily can figure that out. Their member of Congress voted to increase taxes. Right. Is the complicated nature of it kind of insulate them from the political realities?
Right, because again, there's various levers you can raise. They could change a provision within the code, in which basically a non-rate provision within the code, which has the same effect. Because again, you're playing with a bunch of variables at the same time. The two most important are just what's taxed, or what's called the tax base, and then the rate that's applied to that tax base. Again, you can manipulate the base or other provisions to accomplish basically any outcome. Mm-hmm. And and that's why you have these a lot of business provisions. How assets are depreciated. Again, this stuff should be just done with simple rules that don't allow for that type. And many people think they're doing the right thing by reward. Well, homeownership's good. We can all agree on that. So we should subsidize it. Well, not all good things have to be subsidized, right? Yeah. You only really need to subsidize things which aren't optimally provided. And again, some subsidies can go, if you had a job which required frequent moves, right? It doesn't really make sense for you to buy a house, because buying a house requires a large fixed, you have to put down a down payment, pay realtor fees and things. And so we need a system which is flexible, right? Which accommodates both a person who's going to stay in an area for 30 years and a person who has to move every year or two. So, we want an economy which is flexible, dynamic, and and encourages good behavior like working, saving, investing, creating new businesses. So
we have a new Congress coming in, including gentleman here to my right.
Right, sure, I know. Congratulations.
Thank you. I know he'll be a tax champion for the taxpayers, as he's always been in his regular life. Are there any things that you're most excited about with regard to taxes with the new Congress, the opportunities or rumors of things that you've seen or heard?
Sure. I mean, as good as TCJA is, it can always be improved. We talked about a couple ways, I think, which directions we'd move. And there is some momentum to move in those directions, I think. I think people have seen the benefits of TCJA since it was passed in 2017. And hopefully they are thinking, well, we want more of that. So, and again, the beauty of TCJA, one of its beauties is that it's a vehicle whose benefits can be easily expanded and built upon. Again, they could increase savings provisions in it. They could further lower rates. They could further expand the tax base. All of these things would be movement in the right direction.
Patrick, I also have a
Sure.
question for you. There's so many people that will try and argue that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, benefited corporations. It didn't benefit the average citizen, all of that. And it's just not true. I mean, the reality is this benefits every American. If Congress did nothing and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expired, taxes would go up on every single American, right? That pays taxes.
That is right.
Talk about some of the provisions that help the average citizen that's currently in the TCJA and that will expire if Congress doesn't reauthorize that.
Sure. And we talk, I guess the most important, and it is perhaps the most subtle, and that's the effect of TCJA on investment. Again, people's wages are direct, and if you just think about it in your day-to-day life, if you didn't have that computer, like how productive, if you had to write on paper and use a typewriter, how productive would you be? And I would say the same thing for the factory worker. If those tools and the robots and the machines that were available to you, how much would you make? Again, it's this idea of like contrasting the bulldozer operator or someone who uses a backhoe versus someone with a shovel.
Yeah.
You're just so much more productive with that capital, and that capital again reflects other people and yourself. Putting money aside and saying, let's invest this in the future. We're going to invest this in a piece of machinery or what have you, which is going to make the society as a whole much more productive. What that ultimately is delayed consumption, right? Mm-hmm. And we want to encourage that. And again, that having productive, offices and having productive factories, that benefits everybody, right? It just doesn't benefit the person who saved the money, right? And that's the type of things, or when someone opens a business, right? Consumers, someone opens a coffee shop in a place there otherwise wasn't one, right? It's not just whereas like these raw distribution tables would just show you, oh, that person alone is earning all this money and, taking from the community. But of course, that's nonsense, right? The customers who patronize the coffee shop benefit, the town perhaps itself benefits, because it uplifts the downtown area. Again, economic growth, productivity, these have wide-ranging benefits, and perhaps the most important ones are the subtle ones.
Yeah. I'll give you an example of that real quick, and then I promise, David, I'll stop asking questions. I'll give you an example of that. I met with a mechanic, an auto mechanic,
right.
And he told me, he said, look, my tools are the biggest investment I make.
Exactly,
Mechanics buy tools, and they take them, they're their tools, they own them, they take them to wherever they go to work. And he said, I used to not be able to write those off. That's important. I talked to Jason Smith, who's the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, very good man. And I told him about that story, and he said, well, go back and tell that guy it's in TCJA. Right. He can write his tools off. But that's a great example where it helps kind of an average, ordinary citizen make a living.
That is correct, right? That's a form of investment.
Yeah.
And TCJA, under prior law, the mechanic was not able to write the full cost of his tools off.
Right.
Under the current law, they are. And, you can look at that as two ways, right? I mean, you can say, well, that's he alone benefits from being able to write it, but of course not, right? His customers, because he's able to say, buy the latest scan tool or the latest wrenches and what have you. He's able to be much more productive at work. His income goes up. As does the quality of the work that his consumers receive. So again, that's the thing you learn in taxes, that often the most important effects are often the most subtle as well.
Yeah.
I think that one of the main messages that we're kind of hearing is it's another great example of how what Congress does really impacts families, businesses, everyday people. I mean, I think one of the things that Congress does intentionally, probably, maybe unintentionally, is to do things that are out of the viewpoint of regular people, and then they're impacted, families and businesses. And I think that's why it's so important for us to stay engaged. I mean, I hope that this podcast is a way for us to help people understand that, they need to be involved and they need to, be aware of what's going on so they can, defend, in this case, their economic freedom.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Right. I mean, yeah, it's important to be informed and sort of to put pressure on Washington to expand opportunity, and certainly not to limit it, and to expand our freedoms. So, and again, taxes, another subtle attribute of taxes is that, a lot of them are aimed at discouraging, behavior you or I may not like, but again, we live in a free country. I mean, there's taxes, fairly high taxes on alcohol, cigarettes, other things like that. You or I may not like them, although again, we live in a free country, and I think people should be allowed, as long as they don't harm others or their behavior doesn't harm others, that, we should be tolerant and, respect other people's freedom.
Well, Patrick, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks for
today.
having me.
It's been a great discussion. Really appreciate it. Liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it. Go out there, defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.